The mule planted her hooves and refused to move another inch. Not for whips, not for curses, not for the growing crowd of townspeople gathering to watch Boone Delaney make a fool of himself on the wooden bridge. Copper had crossed this bridge 1,000 times before. Through rain, through snow, through the howling winds that swept down from the mountains and made the old planks groan like dying men. But today, something was different. Today, the rust-colored mule stood frozen at the bridge's edge, her ears pinned back, nostrils flaring as if she smelled death itself. Boone wiped sweat from his weathered face despite the cool mountain air. His supply wagon sat heavy with goods for the mining camp on the other side of the canyon, and every minute of delay cost him money he couldn't afford to lose. The bridge stretched ahead, its worn timbers spanning the rocky gorge like the bones of some ancient beast. "Come on, girl," he muttered, tugging at Copper's lead rope. "What's gotten into you?" The mule's brown eyes rolled white with terror. She backed away from the bridge entrance, nearly toppling the wagon as her powerful hindquarters pressed against the wooden sideboard. Her breathing came in sharp, panicked snorts that echoed off the canyon walls below. From the gathering crowd, old Pete called out with a toothless grin, "Maybe she knows something you don't, Boone." The laughter that followed had an edge to it. In a town where survival depended on reading signs and trusting instincts, a working animal's sudden refusal to cross familiar ground was no laughing matter. Mules were stubborn by nature, but Copper had always been different. She was smart, reliable, almost human in her understanding. Boone felt the weight of watching eyes as he approached his mule's head. He placed a calloused hand on her neck, feeling the tremor that ran through her powerful frame. Her fear was real, primal, and completely unlike anything he'd seen from her before. Marshal Wade pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the midday sun. "Problem here, Boone?" "She won't cross," Boone said, his voice tight with frustration. "Been trying for near an hour now." The marshal studied the bridge with the careful eye of a man who'd learned to trust his gut. The structure looked solid enough, its supports driven deep into the canyon walls. But something in Copper's desperate whinnying made him pause. "When's the last time anyone checked under that bridge?" Wade asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, because in all their years of crossing, not one soul had thought to look beneath the weathered planks into the shadows below. Marshal Wade's question spread through the crowd like wildfire. Murmurs rippled from person to person as neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. When was the last time anyone had looked beneath the bridge? The answer was simple and troubling. Never. Doc Holloway stepped forward, his medical bag clutched in one weathered hand. "I've been crossing this bridge for 15 years, he said slowly. "Never once thought to check what might be underneath." Boone felt his stomach tighten. Copper continued to shake, her copper-colored coat dark with sweat despite the cool air. The mule's terror was infectious, spreading through the gathered crowd like a fever. Women pulled their children closer. Men shifted nervously, hands moving instinctively to the tools on their belts. "Maybe we should take a look," Wade said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making hard decisions. The suggestion sent a chill through the gathering. Whatever had spooked Copper so badly might be something none of them wanted to see. But the marshal was right. They couldn't just stand here forever, and they couldn't force the mule across if something was truly wrong. Young Tommy Fletcher, barely 16 and eager to prove his courage, volunteered first. "I can climb down the side," he offered. "Check what's got her so spooked." "No." Wade's response was immediate and firm. "If there's something down there, we do this right. Get some rope from Hartwell's store, long enough to reach the bottom safe." As Tommy ran to fetch the rope, an uncomfortable silence settled over the crowd. Copper's labored breathing was the only sound besides the whisper of wind through the canyon. The mule's eyes remained fixed on the bridge, as if she could see something the humans couldn't. Boone found himself studying the familiar structure with new eyes. How many times had he crossed these planks without a second thought? How many wagons, horses, and people had passed over whatever lay hidden in the shadows below? When Tommy returned with the rope, Marshal Wade tested its strength with experienced hands. The hemp was good quality, meant for hauling ore buckets from the mines. It would hold a man's weight easily enough. "I'll go down," Wade announced, looping the rope around his waist. Doc Holloway shook his head. "Let me. If there's something medical down there, you'll need someone who knows what they're looking at." The argument was brief but heated. In the end, it was decided that Wade would descend while Doc waited at the top with his medical supplies, just in case. As the marshal prepared for his descent, Copper let out a long, mournful sound that chilled everyone to the bone. It wasn't the bray of an angry or stubborn mule. It was something else entirely. A sound of grief so profound it seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. What could possibly be down there that would make a mule cry? Marshal Wade lowered himself over the bridge's edge with methodical precision. The rope groaned against the wooden railing as his boots scraped against the rough canyon wall. Below him, shadows pooled thick and dark where the afternoon sun couldn't reach. "Can you see anything yet?" Doc Holloway called down. "Still going." Wade's voice echoed strangely in the confined space. "Getting darker the further down His words cut off abruptly. The crowd above pressed closer to the bridge's edge, straining to hear. Boone held his breath, one hand still resting on Copper's trembling neck. The mule had gone quiet, but her whole body remained rigid with an alertness that made his skin crawl. "Wade!" Doc Holloway shouted. "What do you see?" A long moment passed before the marshal's voice drifted up from the depths, changed now, hollow with shock. "God Almighty! There's a wagon down here." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. A wagon. Under the bridge they'd all crossed countless times, hidden in the shadows where no one thought to look. "What kind of wagon?" someone called out. "Covered wagon. Smashed to pieces." Wade's voice grew fainter as he moved deeper into the shadows. "Looks like it's been here for years. Maybe longer." Boone's mind raced. A covered wagon meant travelers, pioneers heading west, families seeking new lives in the territories beyond the mountains. But how had it gotten under the bridge? And why hadn't anyone noticed? "Wade, be careful down there," Doc Holloway warned. "Old wood can be unstable." "There's more," the marshal called up, his voice tight with something that might have been horror. "I can see personal belongings scattered everywhere." And Wade paused, and when he spoke again, his words came out in a rush. "There are bones, Doc. Human bones." The collective gasp from the crowd seemed to suck all the air from the canyon. Women covered their mouths in shock. Men removed their hats in instinctive respect for the dead. Children who didn't fully understand pressed closer to their parents, sensing the sudden change in the adults around them. Copper let out another of those heartbreaking sounds, and suddenly Boone understood. The mule hadn't been refusing to cross out of stubbornness or fear for her own safety. She'd been trying to tell them something, trying to honor the dead who lay forgotten beneath their feet. How many? Doc Holloway's medical training kept his voice steady, but Boone could see the physician's hands shaking. "Hard to tell from here. The wagon's badly damaged. Looks like it fell from..." Wade's voice trailed off as the implication hit him. "From the bridge. They fell from the bridge." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and Copper's soft, grieving sounds. Everyone stared at the wooden planks beneath their feet with new horror. How many times had they walked over this spot, laughing and talking, while below them lay the remains of people who'd met their end trying to cross the same span? "I'm coming up," Wade called. "We need to organize a proper recovery." But as the marshal began his ascent, one question burned in everyone's mind. Who were these people? And how long had they been waiting in the darkness for someone to find them? Marshal Wade hauled himself back onto the bridge, his face pale beneath the dust and grime. His hands shook as he brushed dirt from his jacket, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd seen something that would stay with him forever. "We need more men," he said quietly to Doc Holloway, "and more rope. There's a whole family down there." The word family hit the crowd like a hammer blow. This wasn't just some unfortunate traveler who'd met with an accident. These were people, mothers, fathers, maybe children, who'd been lost and forgotten while life went on above them. Boone felt Copper shift beside him. The mule had stopped trembling, but her dark eyes remained fixed on the bridge with an almost human sadness. It was as if she understood that her refusal to cross had finally given voice to the voiceless dead below. "How did they fall?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, her voice barely above a whisper. Wade wiped his face with a trembling hand. "Best I can figure. Their wagon was too heavy for the old planks. Probably during a storm. The woods all rotted where it broke. The whole section gave way, and they went straight down into the canyon." The mental image was horrifying. A family probably desperate to reach safety before dark or before bad weather hit, pushing their heavily loaded wagon across the bridge, only to have the planks collapse beneath them. The screams, the terrible sound of splintering wood, the long fall into darkness. "When do you think it happened?" Doc Holloway asked, though from his expression, he dreaded the answer. "From the condition of the wagon and..." The remains, I'd say 5, maybe 6 years ago. Hard to tell exactly. Wade's voice cracked slightly. There's a child's doll down there. Still has some of its dress left. The revelation sent several women in the crowd to tears. A child, a little one who died in terror and darkness, forgotten by the world until a stubborn mule had refused to cross their grave. Young Tommy Fletcher, who'd been eager to climb down earlier, now looked sick. 6 years, he said hollowly. We've been walking over them for 6 years. The weight of it settled on everyone like a shroud. 6 years of daily crossings. 6 years of merchants and miners, families and travelers, all passing over the remains of people who died trying to do exactly the same thing. We have to bring them up, Wade said firmly. Give them a proper burial. It's the least we can do. But even as he spoke, practical concerns began to surface. The recovery would be dangerous and difficult. The remains were far below, mixed with the debris of the shattered wagon. The bridge itself might not be safe. If it had collapsed once under the weight of a wagon, could it be trusted now? First thing, Doc Holloway said, we need to figure out who they were. Someone, somewhere is probably still wondering what happened to them. As if summoned by his words, old Henrik Anderson pushed through the crowd. The Norwegian immigrant's weathered face was ashen, and his hands clutched a crumpled piece of paper. I know who they are, he said, his accented voice heavy with grief. My God, I know who they are. Henrik Anderson's announcement sent a shock through the gathered crowd. The old Norwegian's hands trembled as he unfolded the yellowed paper he'd been clutching. A letter, worn soft from years of handling. The Brennan family, Henrik said, his voice thick with emotion. Irish folks. Thomas and Mary Brennan, with their little girl Rose. She was maybe 4 years old. Doc Holloway stepped closer, his medical instincts replaced by simple human compassion. How do you know, Henrik? Because I was supposed to meet them here. The old man's eyes filled with tears. 6 years ago, Thomas sent me this letter. Said they were coming west following the mining claims. Asked if I could help them get settled. Maybe find work for Thomas in the mines. Henrik's voice broke as he continued. I waited for them. Waited for weeks. Thought maybe they'd changed their minds. Or taken a different route. Never occurred to me. He gestured helplessly toward the bridge. Marshal Wade studied the letter with grave attention. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. A hopeful message from a man seeking a better life for his family, never knowing that hope would die in the shadows beneath a wooden bridge. They were traveling in a covered wagon, Henrik continued. Thomas mentioned in the letter that they'd loaded it heavy with supplies for the winter, tools, food, everything they owned. He looked at Wade with desperate eyes. That's why it was too heavy for the old planks, isn't it? The marshal nodded grimly. Weight would have been a factor, but the real problem was the storm damage. Some of those support beams had been weakened by years of harsh weather. The wagon was just the final straw. Boone found himself thinking about all the times he'd crossed this bridge with his own heavy loads. How many others had taken the same risk without knowing it? How many had been lucky where the Brennans had not? Copper nudged against his shoulder, a gentle reminder of her presence. The mule's behavior made perfect sense now. Animals had senses humans couldn't understand, ways of knowing things that defied explanation. She'd somehow sensed the tragedy beneath their feet and refused to add to it. We bring them home, Henrik said firmly. Thomas was coming here to start a new life. The least we can do is give them a proper resting place in our cemetery. Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes. That poor little girl, Rose. She should have been playing with my students, learning her letters. The weight of lost possibilities hung heavy in the canyon air. A family's dreams cut short by a moment of structural failure. A little girl who never got to grow up. Parents who died trying to give their child a better future. The recovery won't be easy, Wade warned. We'll need skilled men with ropes and pulleys. Could take days. However long it takes, Doc Holloway said quietly. They've waited 6 years. They deserve to be brought up into the light. As the crowd began to disperse, organizing the massive undertaking that lay ahead, Boone remained by the bridge with Copper. The mule had finally relaxed, though she still refused to set hoof on the wooden planks. You knew, didn't you, girl? He murmured, stroking her neck. Somehow you knew they were down there. Copper turned her intelligent eyes toward him, and for a moment, Boone could swear he saw understanding in those brown depths. Not just animal instinct, but something deeper. something that spoke of respect for the dead and the sacred duty to remember those who'd been forgotten. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon. But tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, they would bring the Brennan family home. The recovery took 3 days. 3 days of careful, heartbreaking work as the men of the town lowered themselves into the canyon's depths to retrieve what remained of the Brennan family's shattered dreams. Marshal Wade led the effort, his experience with dangerous situations proving invaluable as they navigated the treacherous descent. Doc Holloway worked alongside him, his medical knowledge helping to identify and carefully preserve what they found. Every fragment was treated with the reverence due to human remains. Every personal belonging handled as if it were sacred. On the first day, they brought up the broken pieces of the wagon itself, splintered wood that told the story of impact and years of weathering. Mixed among the debris were the practical items of frontier life. A cast iron pot, still recognizable despite the damage. Tools that Thomas Brennan had hoped to use in his new life. Scraps of fabric that had once been clothing or household goods. The second day yielded more personal items that made the tragedy heartbreakingly real. A wooden cross carved by hand that had probably hung in their home back east. A small mirror, its silver backing clouded but unbroken. Henrik wept openly when they brought up a child's wooden blocks, each one carved with letters that little Rose had been learning. Copper had remained near the bridge throughout the recovery, as if keeping vigil. Boone brought her food and water, but the mule seemed more interested in watching the solemn work below than in eating. Other animals in town had begun acting strangely too. Dogs whimpering near the bridge, horses shying away from the area. It was as if all of creation was mourning the Brennans. On the third day, they found the remains themselves. Doc Holloway handled this part with the clinical detachment his profession demanded, but his hands shook as he worked. 3 people, a man, a woman, and a small child, who had died together in a moment of terror that was now 6 years past. They're together, Doc said quietly as the remains were brought up in carefully prepared boxes. Whatever happened, they stayed together. The discovery that affected everyone most was found clutched in Mary Brennan's skeletal fingers, a small locket containing a tiny painted portrait of baby Rose, probably made before they'd left their old home. The locket had survived where so much else had been destroyed, as if love itself could withstand the ravages of time and tragedy. Henrik took responsibility for arranging the funeral, working with Reverend Morrison to plan a service worthy of the family who'd traveled so far, only to die within sight of their destination. Word spread to neighboring settlements and people began arriving to pay their respects to strangers who'd somehow become their own. Funny thing, Henrik told Boone as they watched the funeral preparations. Thomas's letter mentioned that they'd heard this was a good place to raise a family, a place where neighbors looked out for each other. Boone looked around at the crowd of people who'd dropped everything to honor the dead Brennans. Guess they weren't wrong about that. But one question still haunted everyone. If not for Copper's mysterious refusal to cross, how much longer would the Brennan family have remained forgotten in the darkness below? The funeral was held on a crisp morning when the mountain air carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter. Nearly 200 people gathered in the small cemetery overlooking the valley, more than the town had ever seen for any single event. 3 simple wooden coffins sat beside freshly dug graves, each one carved with care by the town's carpenter. The largest bore the inscription, Thomas Brennan, beloved husband and father. The second read, Mary Brennan, devoted wife and mother. The smallest, which brought tears to every eye that read it, simply said Rose Brennan, forever 4 years old. Reverend Morrison spoke of journeys cut short and dreams deferred, but also of communities that honor their dead and the mysterious ways that truth comes to light. Henrik Anderson stood beside the graves, holding Thomas's letter like a sacred text, and spoke about the family's hopes for a new life in a new land. They came here seeking something better, he said, his accented voice carrying across the silent crowd. They found death instead, but in their death, they've given us something precious, a reminder that every life matters, that no one should be forgotten, and that sometimes the humblest creatures among us carry the greatest wisdom. As if summoned by his words, Copper appeared at the edge of the cemetery. The mule had followed the funeral procession from town, and now she stood quietly among the mourners like a guardian angel with 4 legs and a copper-colored coat. Doc Holloway placed small bouquets of wildflowers on each grave, flowers that had grown wild in the canyon where the Brennans had lain for 6 years. In their way, he said softly. They were already part of this place. The earth had begun to reclaim them. We're just making it official. Marshal Wade stepped forward with 3 small items recovered from the wagon. Thomas's pocket watch, stopped forever at the moment of impact. Mary's wedding ring, tarnished but unbroken. And little Rose's wooden doll, its painted face worn but still smiling. These he placed gently on the coffins before they were lowered into the ground. As the first shovelful of earth fell onto Thomas Brennan's coffin, Copper let out a sound unlike any she'd made before. Not the mournful cry of the bridge, but something softer, more peaceful. It was, Boone realized, the sound of completion, of a job finally done. The burial finished as the sun reached its peak. People began to drift away in small groups, but many lingered, reluctant to leave the Brennans alone again after so many years of abandonment. Children placed flowers on the fresh graves, while their parents spoke in hushed tones about the mystery of animal instinct and the debts the living owed to the dead. Henrik was among the last to leave. He stood for a long time reading the headstones, then carefully folded Thomas's letter and placed it under a stone at the head of the family's plot. They made it after all, he whispered, different than they planned, but they made it home. As evening approached, Boone finally coaxed Copper away from the cemetery and back toward town. But instead of taking the main road, the mule led him to the bridge. For the first time in days, she approached the wooden structure without fear. Copper paused at the bridge's entrance, her ears forward, listening to something only she could hear. Then, with quiet dignity, she stepped onto the planks and crossed to the other side. Boone followed, and beneath their feet the bridge held firm. The Brennan family was at rest. Their long journey was over, and somehow, in ways that defied human understanding, Copper had known that her job was done. Epilogue. The bridge was rebuilt the following spring with stronger supports and a memorial plaque honoring the Brennan family. Copper lived many more years, never again refusing to cross any bridge or road. Henrik started a small fund to help other traveling families, ensuring that no one else would face the dangers the Brennans had encountered. The story spread throughout the territory, becoming legend, the tale of a mule who spoke for the voiceless dead and a community that listened. If you enjoyed this story of compassion and mysterious wisdom from the Old West, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a super chat if this touched your heart. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Click the video on your screen to discover another incredible tale from the frontier, where ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances.
They left him behind, alone, scared, and just a baby. No food, no shelter, no reason why. But in the darkest corner of the forest, something unexpected happened. A stray cat, battle-worn and wild, chose compassion over survival. And what they found together changed everything. This isn't just a story about a dog and a cat. It's about what we all need: kindness, connection, and a second chance. The morning fog clung to the towering pine trees of Maple Hollow like a shroud weaving through trunks and blanketing the forest floor in soft silence. The air smelled of wet earth sap and smoke from long-dead campfires. A cold breeze rolled through the Oregon mountains, brushing the dew-covered leaves and sending shivers through the undergrowth. It was the kind of morning that hinted at coming winter, despite the calendar still holding on to early October. In the center of a clearing surrounded by discarded paper plates, melted marshmallow wrappers, and the charred remnants of a fire pit, lay a small, trembling figure barely moving, barely alive. The puppy had once been the picture of joy and vitality, with thick golden fur like warm honey and eyes the color of light maple syrup. But now, caked in dried mud and tangled burrs, that same coat hung limp against his shivering body, his ribs pressed against his skin from hunger. His tail, once wagging in constant delight, curled tightly beneath him in fear. He was no older than 4 months, a golden retriever born into a world he had only just begun to understand before it turned its back on him. His name, though he did not know it anymore, had once been Sunny, a name given by a girl whose laughter still echoed faintly in his dreams. She had tied a ribbon around his neck at the campfire and fed him hot dog pieces when her parents weren't looking. But laughter fades quickly in the wilderness, and ribbons are no match for thorns. He had wandered too far, perhaps, while chasing a moth or following the scent of grilled meat. By the time he returned to the clearing, the cars were gone. The people were gone. Only silence remained. The cold bit into his paws. A gash on his front leg throbbed from a sharp stone. He whimpered a sound that echoed softly through the pines, then fell silent again. There was no answer, just bird song far away and the rustle of something in the bushes. That something was a cat. From the shadows beyond the clearing, a sleek gray figure crouched low, blending into the morning mist. His fur was a mottled charcoal darkened from years of grime and survival. A faint scar ran from above his right eye to the edge of his cheek, the souvenir of a raccoon skirmish or maybe a barbed fence. His name, if one could call it that, was Ash. It was the name the neighborhood kids had whispered when they saw him dart between sheds and alleyways. To them, he was a ghost, a loner, a legend. Ash had lived most of his 6 years navigating the delicate balance between wilderness and town. Too wild to be tamed, too smart to be caught. He trusted no one, especially not humans. They had once left him 2 years ago in a parking lot beside a diner when he was just a kitten. He remembered the smell of French fries, the sound of laughter through rolled-down windows, and then nothing. Just a box left on cold concrete. His golden eyes scanned the shivering mass in the clearing. A dog. A pup. Vulnerable. Useless. He should have walked away. Instead, he stayed. Ash crept forward, placing each paw silently against the mossy earth. He slinked from bush to bush, keeping low, his tail flat. The puppy hadn't seen him yet. He could still vanish, still pretend none of this was happening. But something in the pup's whimper pulled at something buried deep, some dull, unused instinct that made him linger. Sonny lifted his head. His eyes were glazed, but met Ash's. No barking, no growling. Just a flicker of recognition. And hope. Ash froze. This was a mistake. But then the pup let out another whimper, softer now, like a whisper, then laid his head back down. His breathing was labored, shallow. Ash sighed. Behind him, the world rustled and swayed with indifference. But ahead of him, lying helpless on human trash and pine needles, was a creature that had no one. He padded forward. A few miles down the slope, nestled at the edge of Havenwood, a small town with a single diner, a post office, and a few dozen aging houses. An old woman stirred her tea by the kitchen window. The kettle hissed behind her, steam clouding the morning sun. Margaret Holloway, now in her late 70s, wore a thick cardigan over her faded flannel nightgown. Her silver-gray hair was gathered in a messy bun, and her hands, once steady with a scalpel in the operating room, now trembled faintly as she brought her cup to her lips. Margaret had lived in that creaky 2-bedroom house since her husband George passed away 5 years ago. A former veterinarian, she had retired shortly after his death. The laughter had gone from the rooms. The garden she once tended with George had turned wild and overgrown, and yet every morning without fail she left out a small plate of dry kibble and a bowl of water on the back porch. She claimed it was for whoever needed it. Most days it went untouched, but today she noticed muddy paw prints around the bowl, 2 different sizes. One small, one larger. She squinted out into the trees behind her yard, but saw nothing. Still, she left the food. Back in the clearing, Ash was standing next to Sonny now. He didn't touch the dog. Not yet. He just observed. The pup was fading fast. His eyes flickered, his breathing shallow. Ash circled him once, then again. He hissed quietly as a fly buzzed near his ear. With a sudden swiftness, he swiped a leaf from Sonny's fur. It stuck to his claws. Stupid, he thought. This is stupid. He padded away, vanishing into the trees. Then a minute later he returned with something in his mouth, a small piece of bread, hard and stale, stolen from a hiker's trail mix bag days ago. He dropped it in front of the pup, who sniffed it weakly but couldn't eat. Ash hissed again, this time in frustration. He looked toward the distant edge of the forest, the direction of the town. He had gone there before, under cover of night, skimming scraps from the edge of the diner. But he never stayed long. The humans didn't like strays. Dogs barked, kids threw rocks. Still, There was someone there. An old woman. He'd seen her leave food out before. Maybe, just maybe. Ash turned to the puppy again. "Don't die," he muttered, as if Sonny could understand. "You better not die." And for the first time in many, many years, Ash made a choice not for himself, but for someone else. Ash sat still for a long time, crouched beneath the low-hanging boughs of a cedar tree as he stared out at the pup. The weak morning light painted the forest floor in a dull gold, streaking through the pine needles like soft fire. The chill hadn't lifted, and the breath from both creatures puffed out in pale clouds. Sonny hadn't moved since Ash last left. He was alive, but barely. His eyes fluttered open and closed, his small body curled up tighter against the cold. Ash flicked his tail. He didn't like this feeling creeping through his chest. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't fear. It was something worse, something close to responsibility. With a sharp exhale through his nose, Ash stepped out into the open. His paw pads crunched softly against dried pine needles. He padded silently over to the pup and nudged him with his nose. Sonny stirred, letting out a soft, pitiful whimper. His tail thumped once against the ground before he tried and failed to lift his head. Ash glanced around, ears twitching at every sound. The forest was waking up. Crows called to one another above, and somewhere in the distance the low bark of a coyote echoed off the hills. They couldn't stay here. If they did, the pup wouldn't last another night. He began to walk away, then stopped, turned back and growled softly. "Get up," he muttered under his breath. "Move your paws, sunshine." Sonny didn't understand, of course, but he responded to the tone. With a wheezy groan, he lifted his head. Ash stepped closer, nipped lightly at his ear. Sonny whimpered but didn't pull away. Instead, he struggled to his feet, trembling with effort. He stood, took 2 unsteady steps, and collapsed again. Ash hissed. This was going to take forever. Still, something deep within told him it mattered. He would not leave this dog. He couldn't explain why, but the decision had settled in his bones like the chill of the forest floor. So, step by step, nudge by nudge, Ash began guiding the puppy away from the clearing. He stayed close, walking ahead, then doubling back when Sonny lagged too far behind. The going was slow and the path treacherous with exposed roots and damp, moss-covered rocks. But the cat knew the forest better than any trail map could capture. He knew which paths to take that avoided the burrows of foxes and the dens of larger predators. It was an unspoken promise if the dog kept moving, Ash would lead him out. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, though the dense forest canopy allowed only slivers of light to reach them. Birds darted between branches. At one point they startled a deer which bounded off with graceful panic. Sonny tried to bark more from instinct than strength, but it came out as a hoarse wheeze. Ash turned and rolled his eyes. "Save your breath, fuzzball." A few miles away, in a weathered house at the edge of Havenwood, Margaret Holloway stirred in her bed. The ticking of the antique wall clock filled the quiet room, broken only by the occasional creak of old floorboards adjusting to the morning air. The dream had been vivid. Her late husband, George, had stood in the doorway, bathed in warm, golden light. His eyes, always calm, had locked onto hers with a seriousness that clutched her heart. "There's a light in the woods," Maggie he'd said. "It's not meant to be alone." When she opened her eyes, her cheeks were wet. It wasn't the first time George had come to her in dreams, but never with words so clear, so certain. She sat up, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. A strange feeling pulled at her, an urgency she hadn't felt in years. Slipping into her thick robe and worn slippers, she padded through the hallway to the kitchen. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, then moved toward the back porch to check the food bowls. As she opened the screen door, the crisp autumn air greeted her like an old friend. The porch creaked beneath her steps. She looked down. Mud. Not just the scattered paw prints she usually saw from the local raccoons or opossums. These were different. 2 sets, one small and faint like a kitten's, the other larger, clumsier, pressed deeply into the damp earth, and between them marks that looked like the drag of a tail or something being pulled. Margaret's breath caught. She knelt down slowly, one hand resting on her aching knee, and traced the edge of the print with a fingertip. Then she looked up, scanning the edge of the woods beyond her yard. They were out there, whoever they were. Her chest tightened. That strange dream, and now this. She turned and went back inside, grabbing a small bowl of warm chicken broth she had made the night before and a slice of bread. She set them beside the usual kibble dish, then sat in her rocking chair watching. Waiting. Back in the forest, Ash had led Sunny down a gentle slope to a narrow stream. The water trickled over smooth stones, clean and cold. Sunny stumbled toward it and lapped greedily, tail-thumping with the first signs of joy he'd shown all day. Ash drank too, keeping one eye on the shadows, always alert. After resting for a while, they continued slower now, but with purpose. They reached the edge of the woods by late afternoon. Ash led Sunny along the boundary, keeping them in the brush just out of sight from the road and the fences. As they crept toward the edge of a long wooden fence, Ash halted. There it was, the house. Old, painted a soft, faded green with flower beds that had gone wild and ivy crawling up the porch posts. The scent of lavender and wood smoke hung in the air. And by the steps, 2 bowls. Ash didn't hesitate. He darted forward, sniffed, then lapped at the broth. Sunny followed clumsily, but with new hope in his eyes. The warmth soothed his throat. He looked around, his eyes lighting up for the first time in days. From behind the curtain, Margaret watched. She didn't move. Not yet. She simply smiled. The evening descended slowly over Havenwood, painting the sky in streaks of lavender and muted gold. A breeze rustled through the tall grass behind Margaret Holloway's weather-worn house, making the wooden wind chimes on her porch tinkle with a brittle sound. As the light faded, the 2 quiet figures under her back porch remained still, one curled into a fragile ball of golden fur, the other standing like a sentinel tail, twitching ears sharp. Ash sat at the top step, eyes fixed on the door. He had not ventured farther than that. Not into the house, not near the humans, but he remained close enough to listen, to smell, to decide. Sunny lay half asleep in the shadows just beyond the porch rail, a blanket of warmth and broth still settling into his bones. The earlier sip of chicken broth had given him enough strength to move, and now he rested flanks, rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. The gash on his leg was dry, but crusted the fur matted from the long journey and mud-soaked leaves. Margaret inside the kitchen placed a hand against the window glass. The light from her stove cast a soft halo around her figure. Slim, slightly stooped from age, with thin arms and delicate hands that once steadied trembling puppies through surgery. Her eyes were still sharp despite the fine lines that traced their edges, and behind the soft gray bun tied atop her head, there was a strength that had survived years of loneliness, of tending the garden alone, of sleeping beside a pillow that no longer held George's scent. She had watched them for almost an hour. The cat was striking gray with the hint of old scars and survival, his posture rigid and his gaze intelligent. The pup was all vulnerability, yet even in his weakness there was a golden softness that reminded her of something, someone. She moved slowly to the pantry and pulled out a second dish. Into it she poured some softened kibble and a bit of leftover rice from dinner. She added a spoonful of unsalted chicken broth, then carried both bowls to the back porch. Her knees creaked as she stepped onto the wood, but she didn't mind. She had lived long enough to know that every sound a body made was just a part of remembering life. Ash vanished the moment she opened the screen door. He darted into the shadows beneath the porch, his eyes glowing from beneath the boards. Margaret didn't follow him with her gaze. She simply set the bowls down, gave a soft smile, and returned inside, leaving the door ajar. Sunny blinked awake, nose twitching at the scent of warm food. His limbs were slow to respond, but hunger drove him forward. He rose on shaking legs and hobbled to the bowl, nudging it with his snout. A low whine escaped him as he tasted the food, soft, rich, comforting. He ate in small, greedy bites. Ash crept back, not to eat, but to watch. From inside the kitchen, Margaret sat in her rocker with a cup of herbal tea, listening to the sounds of the night and the occasional clink of the ceramic bowl. She didn't need to look to know that the pup was eating, that the cat had returned. She could feel it. Her mind drifted, as it often did in the quiet moments, to decades ago, before Havenwood was quiet, before her hair turned silver and the wind chimes only sang to the empty air. She remembered a summer in Tennessee. She had just married George. They were barely scraping by on his junior faculty salary and her internship at a local clinic. One rainy night, they had found a dog, emaciated, terrified, curled in a ditch by the roadside. George had slammed the brakes without hesitation. "We can't leave him," he'd said. That dog had lived with them for 12 years. They named him Toby. Sonny's golden coat caught a flicker of porch light, and the memory snapped back into her chest like a sudden gust of wind. She rose from her seat. This time she didn't wait. She took a warm towel, stepped onto the porch once more, and moved slowly toward Sonny. The pup looked up, flinched slightly, then lowered his head in submission. Margaret kneeled beside him, one hand reaching out, palm open. "I won't hurt you, sweetheart," she said gently, her voice as soft as her cardigan sleeves. Ash tensed in the shadows. His claws flexed into the earth, ready to spring. But Sonny didn't run. He didn't snap. He simply leaned into her hand, trembling, and closed his eyes. She examined the wound gently. "You've been through too much," she whispered. With careful movements, she began wiping his coat using the towel to remove dirt, sap, and dried blood. She dabbed at the cut with a soft antiseptic cloth she'd warmed slightly, not enough to sting. Sonny whimpered, but didn't pull away. The warmth of her touch, the scent of her hand's lavender and soap seemed to ease the shaking in his muscles. From the edge of the porch, Ash didn't move. He watched. When Margaret finished, she laid the towel across Sonny's side and gently scooted the food bowl closer. Then she rose, turned toward the shadows, and said aloud, not to anyone in particular, "There's enough for both of you." Then she went inside. Ash didn't step forward. Not yet. But when the house lights dimmed and the rocking chair stopped creaking, he approached the bowl, sniffed, and took one bite. Just one. The porch light flickered as the breeze picked up. That night Margaret left the door unlocked. Morning broke over Havenwood with a softness that seemed almost deliberate. The sky was brushed with gentle hues of peach and pale blue, and the air held the light scent of wildflowers mingled with dew. A pair of finches sang from the branches above Margaret Holloway's porch, where a now clean and rested Sonny lay curled on a faded cushion. His golden coat shimmered faintly in the sun, still thin in places but warm and alive again. He stirred in his sleep, paws, twitching in a dream tale, giving the occasional flick. It was the sleep of a creature who knew, at least for now, he was safe. Margaret, dressed in a navy cardigan with tiny pink embroidery along the collar and a pair of old jeans that sagged slightly at the hips, sat in her rocking chair with a book open in her lap. Her hair, silver and wispy, caught the morning breeze as she turned the pages slowly, her eyes occasionally glancing at Sonny rather than the print. The book, one of George's favorites, was more excuse than engagement. She was waiting, watching, nurturing the space without crowding it. She'd placed a second bowl out again, this time with warm milk and a touch of tuna. The milk was untouched so far, but she knew he'd come. The cat. The gray one with the quiet eyes. He was there every evening now, never seen in the light, never closer than the back steps, but always there. The night before, she had heard the softest thump against the side of the porch. In the morning, the bowl was half empty. Ash was a mystery wrapped in silence. He moved like smoke and stared like wind chimes, stared at the breeze, never meeting it, but always feeling its presence. He still didn't trust her. That much was clear. But he hadn't left either. That morning, as Margaret sipped from her chipped ceramic mug, she was not the only one watching. 2 houses down behind the hedge-lined fence and the trimmed tulip beds of a modest single-story home, a small figure crouched at the bedroom window, nose pressed to the screen. Ethan Callahan was 10 years old, small for his age, with dark brown hair that curled into tight waves and pale skin that burned easily in summer. He was a quiet boy, often too quiet. Diagnosed with social anxiety disorder the previous year, he had stopped talking in class entirely and had withdrawn even from his cousins and neighbors. He communicated mostly through nods, gestures, and the occasional whisper to his mother. But every morning since the dog had arrived at Mrs. Holloway's porch, Ethan had watched from his window. He never opened the blinds fully, only just enough to peek through the edge. He'd watched Sonny sleep, watched him roll onto his back and stretch, watched him bark softly at butterflies and wag his tail at robins. Sonny wasn't like other dogs. He was soft, quiet, slow. He didn't jump or bark too loud. He didn't run up to strangers. He just existed gently, and that gentleness resonated with something inside Ethan that had been too frightened to come out. That morning, as his mother made toast in the kitchen, Ethan slipped quietly out the back door, barefoot, still in his oversized t-shirt and pajama pants. He crept along the side fence past the marigolds and paused at the wooden gate that separated his yard from Margaret's. He hesitated. Then he unlatched the gate and slipped through. Sonny raised his head. Margaret noticed the movement at the same moment and gently closed her book. She recognized the boy instantly. Ethan had passed by her house with his mother a few times on walks, always clinging close to her side, eyes cast down. She had never heard him speak. Not once. Sonny stood slowly, tail wagging, low and gentle. Ethan took a shaky step forward. "Hi," he whispered. It was barely audible, like the rustle of paper, but Margaret heard it. Sonny took a step closer. He paused, sat, then wagged again. Ethan smiled. It was the first time in 6 months anyone had seen him do that. Margaret stayed still, as if even breathing too loudly might disrupt the moment. Ethan dropped to his knees. Sonny trotted forward and pressed his head into the boy's lap. Ethan wrapped his arms around the dog and buried his face into his soft fur. A quiet sob escaped him. Not sad, just overwhelmed. Ash, watching from beneath a bush at the edge of the yard, blinked slowly. He did not hiss. He did not retreat. He simply lay down in the grass, his tail curling around his feet. Later that afternoon, after Ethan had gone home, still smiling, Margaret sat on the back steps with her hands clasped around her mug, watching the sun descend behind the cedar trees. Sonny lay sprawled on his side, one ear twitching at the sound of wind. "You're a little miracle," she whispered. That night, she added a soft towel to the spot beneath the porch steps. Ash used it. The early morning light filtered through the tall hedges bordering Margaret's backyard, casting long shadows over the dew-dappled grass. A thin mist clung to the air, softening every sound: the flutter of wings overhead, the distant creak of an old windmill from a nearby barn, and the faint clink of a metal chain swinging gently against wood. The scent of rosemary and damp earth drifted from Margaret's herb garden, where bees were already beginning their slow hum of work. Sonny was sniffing around the base of the old lattice fence tail, wagging steadily, nose twitching with purpose. His coat had thickened again, no longer patchy and dull, but golden and full, warmed by days of good food, deep sleep, and gentle hands. He carried himself with quiet confidence, now a pup transformed not by medicine, but by belonging. Ash watched from atop the garden table, his gray coat brushed clean by habit and necessity, his tail curled around his paws. His scarred face had softened not in appearance, but in expression. The tension that had once defined his every movement had begun to ebb. Where once he flinched at every sudden sound, now he only flicked an ear. And he no longer watched Sonny with suspicion. He watched with interest. That interest deepened when Sonny paused, stiffened, and let out a low, alert bark. He had picked up something odd. Ash leapt from the table and landed silently beside him. Sonny nosed toward the edge of the fence, specifically a clump of ivy covering the bottom where Margaret's yard met the side property, an empty vacation cottage owned by a couple who rarely visited. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, but one cut through all the rest, rusted metal and blood. Ash padded closer. Beneath the ivy, mostly buried in the mulch and roots, was a crude wire trap, likely intended for rodents, the kind of spring-loaded snare that snapped shut the moment it was disturbed. And it had been disturbed. Ash's paw, curious and too quick, caught the edge of the mechanism as he moved closer. There was a metallic snap. Ash let out a furious, pained yowl. The trap clamped down on his left front paw, not enough to break bone, but enough to pierce skin and hold fast. He thrashed, hissing violently, claws raking the earth, trying to shake free. His body twisted in panic, fur puffed and wild. Sonny lunged forward. He barked sharply once, twice, then moved to Ash's side. His eyes were wide, unsure, but focused. Carefully, he placed a paw on the edge of the trap, pushing it down while nosing the lever with his snout. It didn't work at first, but he tried again this time, pressing with his full weight. The metal creaked, then gave with a sudden pop. Ash yanked his paw free and stumbled back, panting, fur bristled. Blood dotted the ground beneath him, small and dark. Margaret, who had heard the commotion from inside, hurried out with her shawl barely draped across her shoulders. She found the two animals standing close together, Ash trembling slightly. Sonny at his side, tongue lolling in concern. "Oh, sweet mercy," she gasped, rushing to them. Ash bolted at first, but only a few feet, then stopped, letting Margaret kneel near him. Her hands were steady. She spoke calmly, firmly, as she examined the wound. "It's shallow. You're lucky, sweetheart. Could have been far worse." She scooped him up gently, carried him inside, and placed him on a soft towel atop her laundry counter. Ash didn't fight. Sonny followed at her heels. She cleaned the wound with warm water and iodine, wrapping the paw in gauze. Ash winced but didn't scratch. He watched her with wary eyes, but no longer with fear. When she was done, she gave him a light stroke across his ears. "You're a brave old thing," she whispered. That afternoon, the change in Ash was subtle but unmistakable. He followed Sonny into the yard instead of watching from the porch. When Sonny pounced on a pine cone and rolled in the leaves, Ash swatted it toward him with his uninjured paw. They played not with wild abandon, but with mutual curiosity, a rhythm found only in unlikely friendships. Margaret watched them from the patio table with a knitting project in her lap, the needles still for long moments as she smiled. Her heart felt warm in a way it hadn't since George had passed, filled not with memories of what she'd lost, but with gratitude for what remained. Later that day, Ethan returned. He now visited daily, never speaking more than a few words, but words nonetheless. That afternoon he came with a small notebook filled with drawings, dogs mostly, and one very detailed sketch of Sonny curled in sleep. Margaret met him at the back gate and they walked side by side into the yard. "Would you like to learn how to brush him properly?" she asked, kneeling with Sonny. Ethan nodded, eyes bright. He whispered, "Yes, please." Margaret showed him how to hold the soft bristle brush, how to move gently along the grain of Sonny's fur, how to talk softly while brushing to reassure the dog. Ethan followed her instructions with care and reverence. Sonny leaned into the stroke's tail, wagging lazily. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, Margaret brought out lemonade and a small plate of cookies. She placed a cup in front of Ethan, who took it with both hands and whispered, "Thank you." She looked at him, then really looked. The fear was still there, buried behind his soft eyes. But now there was something else, too. Trust. Ash, resting on the steps with his bandaged paw tucked beneath him, blinked slowly at the boy. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply watched, then licked his paw once content. By late afternoon, the skies over Havenwood had taken on a brooding shade of slate gray. The wind, once warm and playful, had turned sharp and restless, tearing through the pine trees with a rising urgency. The birds had gone silent. Leaves scattered across Margaret Holloway's garden like hurried whispers, and a low, distant rumble vibrated through the ground like a warning. Sonny sensed it first, his ears flattened tail low. He paced near the back porch, nose tilted upward, sniffing at the charged air. His golden coat bristled as the first drops fell cold, fat, and sudden. Margaret, sitting on the porch swing with her knitting needles idle in her lap, looked up. "Storm's coming," she murmured. "A strong one, I'd wager." Ash was already crouched under the patio table, his eyes narrowed at the growing wind. His wounded paw had mostly healed, but his instinct told him something was off. He flicked his tail once, then again. Ethan, who had arrived just after school with a pack of dog treats in hand, stood uncertainly at the back door, watching Sonny pace. "Should I call him inside?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, darling," Margaret said, rising. "Let's bring them both in." The forecast said gusts and thunder. "Don't want them out there." But Sonny wasn't waiting. Another rumble of thunder cracked across the sky, closer this time, and the pup let out a sharp yelp of fear. His body stiffened, then sprang into motion. He bolted, down the garden path, across the side yard, and through the gap in the hedge that led to the woods behind Havenwood. Sonny Ethan cried, stepping out into the yard. "Stay here," Margaret shouted, already grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. Ethan inside, but Ash didn't wait. The cat shot out from under the porch and darted after the pup, his lean body cutting through the wind like a shadow. His instincts screamed against it. He hated storms, hated running, but something else, something deeper, kept him going. Margaret called the town sheriff within minutes. The storm was rolling in fast now, sheets of rain blowing sideways, trees bending at their roots. Thunder roared over the hills like cannon fire. Havenwood was used to strong weather, but not like this, not so sudden. Within half an hour, the whole town seemed to stir. Dale, the middle-aged mechanic from Main Street with a thick beard and a voice like gravel, offered to drive the back roads in his truck. Marta Reyes, the grocery clerk with copper-red hair and a fearless streak, grabbed a flashlight and started combing the alleys between houses. Teenagers from the high school, led by a lanky boy named Cole, who ran track, pulled on raincoats and took off toward the creek path with headlamps and ropes. Everyone knew the dog, the golden pup, who now lounged on Mrs. Holloway's porch or played with the quiet neighbor boy. Sonny had become a part of Havenwood in ways no one had really said aloud. Ethan, trembling in the hallway, watched all this unfold with wide eyes. Margaret paced with the phone pressed to her ear, coordinating volunteers giving descriptions. The wind howled outside. The power flickered. Then Ethan moved. He pushed open the front door, ignoring the rain that immediately soaked his hoodie and sneakers. Margaret called after him, but something in his stride was firm new. He ran toward the center of the search party, forming by the sidewalk where a few neighbors gathered with flashlights. "Wait!" he shouted. It was loud. It cracked through the storm. Voices stopped. Heads turned. "I know where he might go," Ethan cried again, louder this time. "He always chases squirrels near the fence trail behind the Lawsons' barn. There's a hollow tree he hides there sometimes." Margaret stood on the porch, stunned. It was the first time Ethan had spoken in front of a group since he was 5. A woman from the search party, a tall African-American nurse named Tanya, with an easy smile and soaked scrubs still clinging to her frame, knelt beside him. "Can you show us?" Ethan nodded. Tanya turned to the others. "Let's go." Within minutes, the group moved into the woods, flashlights cutting through the downpour like searchlights. Ash's trail was faint, washed quickly by the rain, but the hollow tree wasn't far. When they found it, Ethan was right. Sonny was there, curled beneath the thick trunk, trembling and soaked to the bone. Ash stood beside him, soaked but watchful ears, flicking at every sound. Ethan knelt in the mud, tears mingling with the rain on his cheeks. "Hey," he whispered. "It's okay. I found you." Sonny whimpered and crawled toward him, pressing his head against Ethan's soaked hoodie. Ash followed. Back at the house, Margaret had laid out towels and warm broth and a blanket beside the fireplace. Sonny was dried, fed, and asleep within the hour. Ash curled on the rug nearby, still damp but too tired to care. Ethan sat beside them, sipping hot cocoa. Margaret handed him a fresh pair of socks, a smile playing on her face. "You were brave today," she said. Ethan looked up, his voice quiet but strong. So was he. Margaret glanced at Sonny, then at Ash. "Yes, so were all of you." Outside, the storm raged for hours. But inside that little house on the edge of Havenwood, there was warmth, safety, and something even deeper connection. The morning after the storm arrived like a gentle apology. The sky, freshly rinsed, stretched out in a brilliant wash of pale blue. Raindrops still clung to the grass in Margaret Holloway's garden, and the scent of pine-wet soil and rose leaves perfumed the cool air. Birds cautiously resumed their songs, hopping between branches, reclaiming their routines. Inside the small house on the edge of Havenwood, Margaret moved slowly through the kitchen, her old flannel robe trailing slightly behind her. She clutched a steaming mug of chamomile tea between both hands, her knuckles swollen slightly from age and arthritis. But despite the ache in her joints, her heart was warm. Sonny lay on the old quilt near the fireplace, still drowsy but visibly calmer, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. His golden coat, brushed and dry, reflected soft morning light. His paw was wrapped lightly where it had scraped on a branch, but he showed no sign of distress. Instead, he gazed up at Margaret with a kind of quiet trust that filled her chest with something she hadn't felt in years, pride and perhaps even purpose. Ash, in a moment that none of them had expected, had followed them all the way into the house the night before, not just to the porch, not to the threshold, but into the warmth, past the rug and beneath the worn velvet armchair near the window. There he stayed, curled up in a crescent of gray fur, only his amber eyes visible beneath his tucked paw. He didn't run when Margaret passed by. He didn't flee when Ethan sat on the floor with a blanket and began to draw. For once, he had decided to stay. Margaret lowered herself into the rocker beside the fire and looked out the window toward the garden. The wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze. The storm had passed, in more ways than one. Later that afternoon, after Sonny had eaten a light meal and Ethan had returned home for dinner, a knock sounded at the front door. Margaret wasn't expecting visitors. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door cautiously, her mind flickering with concern. On the porch stood a woman in her mid-30s, tall and slender with cropped blonde hair tucked beneath a canvas hat. Her face was weathered but pleasant with faint crow's feet at the corners of her eyes that held a mixture of curiosity and restrained hope. "Hi," the woman said, voice soft. "Sorry to bother you. Are you Margaret Holloway?" Margaret nodded. "I am. Can I help you?" The woman extended a laminated flyer. On it was a photo of Sonny, muddy and matted, but unmistakably him, pulled from Margaret's found dog poster she had taped to the grocery store window weeks ago. "I saw your notice," the woman said. I'm not his owner, but I recognized the pup. I saw him once during a church picnic in the forest. My niece had taken a photo. He was wandering near their tents. We tried to catch him, but he ran off before we could help." Margaret took the flyer, her heart thumping gently. "That was the same weekend we found him here." The woman nodded. "I've been keeping an eye out ever since. I was visiting family in Portland, but came back this week and thought I'd check." Margaret studied her carefully. There was sincerity in her posture, not pushiness. A quiet gentleness. Still, she asked, "Are you looking to claim him?" The woman smiled, eyes softening. "Only if you're unable to keep him. I run a small animal sanctuary just outside of town, Riverbend Rescue. We focus on abandoned dogs and senior pets. I thought, if you were overwhelmed or just fostering him temporarily, I could take him." Margaret stepped aside, inviting her in. Sonny, who had been resting in the living room, raised his head and looked toward the door. When the woman stepped into view, he stood slowly, his tail wagging once cautiously. He sniffed the air, then approached. She knelt without reaching for him, simply letting him investigate. "You're stronger now," she whispered. "You did it, didn't you?" Sonny licked her hand once, but then turned and returned to Margaret's side, pressing his head lightly against her thigh. The woman looked up, smiled again. "He's chosen." Margaret gave a soft laugh, brushing a hand over Sonny's head. "He has." The woman rose. "Then I won't get in your way. I just wanted to make sure he had somewhere safe. And now I know." They chatted briefly. The woman introduced herself as Natalie Groves. She wore hiking boots worn down at the heel and a small cross pendant that she touched whenever she talked about her animals. She spoke kindly but without pity. She offered supplies if Margaret needed food, vet help, blankets. No obligation, just community. As Natalie turned to go, Ash stepped quietly out from beneath the chair and stared at her from a distance. Natalie noticed, then lowered her voice. "He's a wonder, too. Some animals, they find their way to the right people." Margaret walked her to the gate. "I think he's helping me remember who I used to be." Natalie paused. "Then maybe he was never lost. Maybe he was meant to find you." When the gate clicked shut and the porch was quiet again, Margaret returned inside, her eyes misty but light. That night, Sonny curled beside the fireplace, closer to Margaret's feet than ever before. Ash, as if to acknowledge the shift, leapt up onto the windowsill and lay stretched across the sill as though guarding the night. The storm had brought fear and flight, but now there was a calm that felt earned. And for the first time since George had passed, Margaret looked around her small home and thought, this house isn't quiet anymore. It's alive. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm, gentle, unhurried, almost sacred. Autumn settled more deeply into Havenwood, casting golden light over the hills and painting the trees in flames of orange, red, and amber. The air grew crisper with each sunrise, and Margaret Holloway began placing a thicker quilt on her bed at night. But inside her small home, warmth reigned. Sonny, now fully recovered, had blossomed into a joyful presence. His golden coat was lush again, thick and soft, gleaming in the sun like spun honey. His eyes were bright and intelligent, always following Margaret around the house from kitchen to porch to garden path. He had grown more confident and yet never lost his gentle nature. He would rest his head on Margaret's lap during evening tea, nuzzle Ethan's hand, when the boy sat quietly drawing in the grass, and curl around Ash during the chilly nights without hesitation. Ash, for his part, had become a fixture, not just a shadow passing through, but a full member of the household. He remained cautious with strangers and still preferred to sleep under the window rather than on a cushion. But he allowed Margaret to brush his coat now, and he accepted her soft-spoken affection without retreat. He and Sonny had developed a bond that needed no barking or meowing, just shared space, mutual watching, and occasionally playful swats and chase games in the leaves. Margaret's house, once still and echoing with memory, now bustled softly with life. She had taken to baking again, filling the kitchen with scents of cinnamon bread and pumpkin pie. Ethan visited every afternoon, his quiet presence now filled with budding curiosity and confidence. He asked questions. He made jokes. He laughed out loud. And with every wag of Sonny's tail or soft blink from Ash, he grew bolder. Neighbors began to notice the change not only in Ethan but in Margaret too. She smiled more. She stood a little taller. She walked with a new steadiness, as if her days had meaning again. And while she never sought out visitors, people had begun stopping by more often. Marta from the grocery brought by extra vegetables. Tanya, the nurse, dropped off old towels from the clinic for pet bedding. Natalie from the rescue sanctuary sent a bag of treats and a card. But the truest change came on a quiet Thursday morning. Margaret had been sorting through boxes in her hallway closet, dusting off forgotten books and photo albums, when she stumbled across an old Bible, leather-bound edges worn and frayed, the spine softened by years of use. It had once belonged to George. She hadn't opened it in ages. She carried it into the living room where the fireplace crackled gently. Sunny lay near the hearth half asleep while Ash perched on the windowsill watching leaves fall. Margaret opened the book slowly, fingers brushing over the delicate pages. Inside the front cover, written in George's looping script, was a note. Just a line. One she had forgotten entirely. When God sends light, don't turn away. Let it in. Her breath caught. She read it again. Outside, the wind picked up, slightly rattling the porch chimes in a quiet harmony. She glanced toward Sunny, curled up like a ray of sun in fur. Then to Ash, eyes closed but face turned toward the light. She smiled. That evening after supper, Margaret sat with Ethan on the back steps. They watched the sun dip low behind the trees, casting shadows long and golden across the yard. Sunny lay at their feet, tail tapping lazily. Ash was stretched across the step above them, his head resting on a folded towel. Ethan leaned against Margaret's shoulder. "You think they'll stay forever?" he asked, voice hushed. Margaret looked down at the boy, her arm wrapping around his small shoulders. "I don't know about forever," she said. "But they're home now. That's enough for me." Ethan nodded. He smiled. "Me too." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret returned to the Bible once more. She placed it beside her lamp and touched the note again. Her fingers trembled, but not from age. From something deeper. Something like grace. For the first time in years, she prayed not for anything new, not for change or strength, but in thanks. For the storm that led Sunny to her porch. For the scarred cat who followed him. For the shy boy next door who began to laugh again. For the house that once stood quiet but now pulsed with breath. She whispered amen into the darkness. And outside, beneath a sky awash with stars, the porch light glowed softly like a lantern for all those still wandering toward love. Sometimes the miracles we pray for don't arrive as thunder from the heavens. They come quietly on 4 muddy paws or beneath the cautious gaze of a stray cat. They come through the laughter of a shy child, learning to smile again through the warm light in an old woman's home that once knew only silence. Sunny and Ash were never just animals. They were messengers of grace, reminders that when we open our hearts, healing finds its way in, as the Bible once whispered through George's hand. When God sends light, don't turn away. In our daily lives, we are surrounded by small miracles. A kind gesture, a new beginning, a friend who chooses to stay. Don't overlook them. Don't shut the door. Because love, in its purest form, rarely knocks loudly. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts. How did Sunny or Ash remind you of someone in your life? And if you believe in second chances and compassion, in the quiet miracles God sends us every day. Subscribe to this channel for more heartfelt stories, and comment Amen to pray for more homes filled with light, love, and purpose. May God bless you for every kindness you carry in your heart.